The morning mist was still rolling off Pine Lake when I heard the sharp crack of high heels on my wooden dock. I didn't know it yet, but those footsteps belonged to the woman who would spend the next 8 months trying to destroy my life. By the end of the story, I'd own her precious clubhouse, and she'd be the one packing her bags. I'd owned my lake cabin for 3 blissful years. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a modest frame with weathered cedar siding and a wraparound porch that jutted out over the water. But it was mine. Every morning, I'd sit on that dock with my coffee, watching the loons dive for fish, while the sun painted the pine trees gold. The Pinewood Lake community was small, just 47 cabins scattered around the shoreline, connected by a winding gravel road. Most of us were weekend warriors or retirees who kept to ourselves. The HOA existed mainly to maintain the private road and the little clubhouse where we held the occasional community meeting. That changed the day Margaret Thornfield moved into the massive lakefront mansion that had been for sale for 2 years. I first met her on a Tuesday morning in late May. The temperature had finally hit 70 degrees, and I was on my dock replacing some loose boards when I heard those heels clicking across the wooden planks behind me. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. "You must be the owner of this." I turned around to see a woman in her mid-50s wearing a crisp white blazer and perfectly pressed slacks, completely inappropriate attire for a lake community where most people lived in fishing gear and flip-flops. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, and she wore oversized sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "I'm Margaret Thornfield," she announced, extending a manicured hand that she clearly expected me to shake. "I just purchased the Kellerman estate." I wiped the sawdust off my palm and shook her hand briefly. "Nice to meet you. I'm Jake Morrison. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her smile was as artificial as the sweetener in gas station coffee. "Thank you. I have to say, I'm a bit concerned about some of the standards in our little community. Your dock, for instance, appears to be in violation of several HOA guidelines." I looked down at my dock. Sure, it was showing its age, but it was structurally sound and well-maintained. "What guidelines?" She pulled out a folder. Who brings a folder to introduce themselves to neighbors, and flipped through several pages with theatrical precision. "According to Article 7, Section 3 of our covenants, all waterfront structures must maintain a uniform aesthetic standard. Your dock is clearly weathered beyond acceptable limits." "I've lived here for 3 years," I said slowly. "This is the first I'm hearing about any aesthetic standards." "Well," she said, her tone turning icy, "that was under the previous management. I've recently been elected to the HOA board, and I intend to bring some much-needed order to this community." The way she said elected made my stomach drop. In a community of 47 cabins, board elections usually consisted of whoever was willing to volunteer getting the job by default. Margaret hadn't been elected. She'd simply shown up and claimed the throne. "I'll expect you to address these violations within 30 days, she continued, handing me a formal-looking document. "Failure to comply will result in fines and potential legal action." As she clicked away in her ridiculous heels, I stared down at the violation notice in my hands. It was printed on expensive letterhead and contained a list of supposed infractions that read like someone had scoured the HOA covenants looking for anything they could twist into a weapon. But what really made my blood run cold was the signature at the bottom, not just Margaret's, but 2 other board members I'd never heard of. She hadn't just appointed herself to the board. She'd somehow managed to take control of the entire thing. The next morning, I drove over to visit Tom Patterson, who'd been living at the lake longer than anyone and had served as the informal HOA president for years. His cabin sat on a quiet cove about a mile from mine, surrounded by the kind of overgrown garden that attracts hummingbirds and drives perfectionist neighbors insane. Tom was on his porch, sanding down an old rocking chair when I pulled up. He looked up with the kind of weathered smile that comes from decades of lake living. "Jake, what brings you by?" I handed him Margaret's violation notice. His smile faded as he read. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "She works fast." "Tom, what happened at the last board meeting? How did she get elected?" He set down his sandpaper and sighed. "There wasn't a meeting, Jake. At least, not one the rest of us knew about. Apparently, she called a special emergency sessions and invited only a few people, new residents who don't know how we've been doing things around here. By the time word got out, she'd already been voted in as president, along with two of her cronies as vice president and secretary. That can't be legal." "Probably not, but proving it's another story. She's got lawyers, Jake. Good ones. And she's been going through our covenants with a fine-tooth comb, looking for anything she can use." Over the next hour, Tom filled me in on the scope of Margaret's ambitions. She didn't just want to clean up the lake community, she wanted to transform it into some kind of exclusive resort. Property values, she claimed, would skyrocket if they could just get rid of the undesirable elements. Apparently, I was element number one. "She's targeting you because your property is right in the middle of her grand vision," Tom explained. "Your lot has the best water access on the North Shore. If she can force you out, she can probably buy your place cheap and either flip it or expand her own property." The morning sun was getting hot, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, though whether from the temperature or anger, I couldn't say. "So what's our move?" "We fight back," Tom said. "The annual meeting is in 2 months. If we can get enough people together, we can vote her out." It sounded simple enough, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Thornfield wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I was right. When I got back to my cabin, there was already another violation notice taped to my door, this time citing improper storage of recreational equipment because I kept my kayak on a rack beside the cabin. According to the notice, all watercraft had to be stored in approved facilities that, conveniently, didn't exist anywhere in our community. By the end of June, Margaret had filed 17 separate violation notices against my property. My dock was too weathered. My kayak rack was an eyesore. My propane tank wasn't properly screened. My outdoor shower violated setback requirements. The list went on and on, each notice more ridiculous than the last. But the violations weren't just harassment, they came with teeth. Each citation carried a $50 fine that would double every 30 days if not addressed. By Margaret's calculations, I already owed the HOA over $800 in penalties. I'd spent most of my savings on cabin improvements the previous year, and the fines were starting to hurt. Worse, every time I fixed one violation, Margaret would find 2 more. It was like playing whack-a-mole with the opponent who kept adding new holes to the board. The breaking point came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in early July. I was inside my cabin, trying to stay cool with a couple of fans while I worked on my laptop, when I heard a truck rumbling up my driveway. Through the window, I watched a county code enforcement officer climb out of a white pickup truck. He was a big guy with a bushy mustache and the tired look of someone who'd been dragged into a neighbor dispute he didn't want to deal with. "You Jake Morrison?" he asked when I met him on the porch. "That's me." He handed me an official-looking document. "I'm Officer Reynolds with the county. Got a complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. Mind if I take a look around?" My heart sank as I scanned the complaint form. Margaret had reported my dock, my outdoor shower, and my storage shed as illegal structures that posed safety hazards to the community. She had also somehow convinced the county that I was operating a commercial enterprise out of my cabin, apparently based on the fact that I worked remotely and, occasionally, took business calls from my porch. "This is my primary residence," I explained, as Officer Reynolds walked around my property, taking photos and making notes. "Everything you see has been here since before I bought the place." "That may be," he said, "but without proper permits on file, the county has to treat them as new construction. You'll need to apply for retroactive permits or remove the structures." "How much will that cost?" "Depends on what the inspector finds, but you're probably looking at a couple thousand in fees minimum. Could be more if anything needs to be brought up to current codes." As the code enforcement truck disappeared down my driveway, I stood on my porch, feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Margaret wasn't just trying to annoy me into leaving, she was trying to financially ruin me. The permit fees alone would eat up most of my emergency fund. If the county decided my dock needed major structural work, I'd be looking at tens of thousands of dollars in costs. I was still staring down the driveway when my phone rang. Tom Patterson's number showed on the screen. "Jake, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you meet me at Mel's Diner in town? And don't use the main road, take the back way through the state forest." The urgency in his voice sent a chill down my spine despite the oppressive heat. 20 minutes later, I found Tom sitting in a corner booth at Mel's, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that had probably been sitting there for an hour. The diner was nearly empty, just us, a trucker at the counter, and Mel herself wiping down tables with the methodical rhythm of someone who'd been doing the same job for decades. "She's got to pee," Tom said the moment I sat down. What?" "Private investigator. Margaret hired one to dig up dirt on everyone who's been opposing her. He's been asking questions around town, going through public records, the whole 9 yards. What kind of dirt could she possibly find on me? I pay my taxes, I don't have a criminal record, and I've never even had a parking ticket." Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice even though there was no one around to hear us. "It's not about what she finds, Jake. It's about what she can make stick. You know how these HOA battles go. Truth doesn't matter as much as who has the better lawyers and deeper pockets." He was right, and we both knew it. Margaret had already demonstrated her willingness to bend the rules and exploit legal technicalities. If her I found even the smallest irregularity in my background, she'd weaponize it. "There's something else," Tom continued. "I heard she's been talking to the other board members about calling a special assessment, claiming the community needs emergency funds for infrastructure improvements. Guess who will be on the hook for the biggest share? The assessment would be based on property values, and my waterfront lot was one of the most valuable in the community. If Margaret could push through a special assessment of even $10,000 or $15,000, it would be the final nail in my financial coffin." But as I sat there listening to Tom outline Margaret's strategy, something unexpected happened. Instead of panic, I felt a cold, calculating anger settling in my chest. I'd been playing defense since this whole thing started, reacting to Margaret's moves instead of making my own. It was time to change tactics. But first, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. That evening, I did something I'd never thought I'd need to do as a lakefront property owner. I hired my own lawyer. Sarah Chen was a real estate attorney with a reputation for handling difficult HOA disputes. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, all polished hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling law books. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, but she had the kind of sharp, focused energy that suggested she didn't lose cases often. "Let me see everything," she said, after I'd explained the situation. I spread Margaret's violation notices across her desk like a deck of cards from hell. Sarah studied each one with the careful attention of a bomb disposal expert examining suspicious wiring. "Your HOA president is either very smart or very lucky," she said finally. "Every one of these citations is technically within the bounds of your community covenants, even if they're being applied in ways the original authors never intended. So, I'm screwed?" Not necessarily. The good news is that she's overplaying her hand. The county code enforcement complaint, the private investigator, the rapid-fire violations, it all suggests a pattern of harassment that could work in our favor. But we need to be strategic about how we respond. Sarah explained that HOA disputes often came down to who could better navigate the intersection of property law, contract law, and community governance. Margaret had lawyers, but she also had weaknesses. Her aggressive tactics had likely made her enemies within the community, and her rushed takeover of the board had created procedural vulnerabilities we could exploit. The key is documentation, Sarah said. Every interaction, every violation notice, every conversation with other residents. We need to build a case that shows a pattern of abuse of power. Over the next week, I followed Sarah's advice religiously. I installed security cameras around my property to record any future inspections Margaret might conduct. I started attending every HOA board meeting armed with a digital recorder and a notebook. I reached out to other residents to document their experiences with the new regime. What I found was both encouraging and disturbing. Margaret hadn't limited her campaign to me. She'd been systematically targeting anyone she saw as an obstacle to her vision for the community. Tom Patterson had received citations for his overgrown landscaping. The Hendersons, an elderly couple in their 80s, had been fined for parking their RV in their own driveway. Even the community pastor, who lived in a modest cabin on the East Shore, had been hit with violations for hosting small Bible study groups that allegedly violated occupancy limits. But Margaret had made one crucial error. She'd underestimated the lake community's capacity for passive-aggressive resistance. While she'd been busy issuing citations and threats, the residents had been quietly organizing. An informal network of phone calls and coffee meetings had been building momentum for the annual meeting in August, where Margaret's board could theoretically be voted out. The problem was that Margaret knew it too. I found out just how much she knew when I got home from work on a Friday evening in late July. Another violation notice was taped to my door, but this one was different from the others. Instead of citing some obscure covenant violation, it informed me that the HOA board had voted to place a line on my property for unpaid fines and assessments. The amount was staggering, over $12,000 in accumulated penalties, plus interest and administrative fees. According to the notice, I had 30 days to pay in full or face foreclosure proceedings. My hands were shaking as I called Sarah Chen's emergency number. "She can't do that, can she?" I asked when Sarah picked up. "Unfortunately, she probably can. Most HOA covenants include provisions for liens and foreclosures in cases of unpaid assessments. The question is whether the underlying fines and fees are legitimate. What are my options? We fight it in court, but that could take months and cost more than you have. Or," Sarah paused, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, "or we get creative." "What do you mean?" "I need to do some research. Don't do anything until you hear from me. Don't pay the lion. Don't respond to any more notices. Don't even talk to Margaret if you can avoid it. I think there might be another way to handle this, but I need to check something first." That weekend was one of the longest of my life. I spent most of it sitting on my dock, staring out at the lake, and wondering if I was about to lose everything I'd worked for. The water was unusually calm, like a mirror reflecting the pine trees and the cloudless sky. It should have been peaceful, but all I could think about was Margaret's ultimatum and the ticking clock of the lion deadline. Sunday evening, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Jake, I need you to come to my office first thing Monday morning," she said. "And bring your checkbook. We're going to make Margaret Thornfield an offer she can't refuse." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, with a kind of persistent rain that makes everything smell like wet pine needles and possibilities. I sat in Sarah's office, nursing my third cup of coffee and trying to process what she was telling me. "The HOA is broke," Sarah said, spreading financial documents across her desk. "Not just cash pool, actually insolvent." Margaret's been so focused on her power grab that she's ignored the community's basic financial obligation. They're 3 months behind on road maintenance, 2 months behind on insurance premiums, and they defaulted on the clubhouse mortgage last month. The clubhouse has a mortgage. Apparently, the previous board took out a loan 5 years ago to renovate the building. Margaret either didn't know about it or assumed it would just take care of itself. Either way, the bank is ready to foreclose. I stared at the mortgage documents. The clubhouse wasn't much a modest building with a meeting room, a small kitchen, and a couple of bathrooms, but it sat on 2 acres of prime lakefront property right in the center of the community. More importantly, it was the symbolic heart of the HOA's power structure. How much does the HOA owe? $87,000 plus interest and penalties. The bank wants it gone. They're motivated to make a deal with anyone who can close quickly and pay cash. "Sarah, I don't have $87,000 lying around." "Actually, you do." She pulled out another set of documents. "Your cabin is worth at least $200,000, probably more in the current market. You can get a home equity loan for the full amount of the clubhouse debt, buy the property from the bank, and become the HOA's new landlord overnight." The audacity of it took my breath away. Instead of fighting Margaret's lion, I would sidestep the entire battle by buying the ground she stood on. What happens to the HOA if I own the clubhouse? That's the beautiful part. According to your community covenants, the HOA has the right to use the clubhouse in perpetuity as long as they maintain it and pay all associated costs. But if they can't pay those costs, if they're in default on their obligations, that right becomes void. You'd own the building, the land, and you'd have the legal right to evict any organization that couldn't pay fair market rent, including Margaret's board, especially Margaret's board. We spent the rest of the morning working out the details. Sarah would contact the bank and negotiate a quick, close sale. I would apply for the home equity loan that afternoon. If everything went smoothly, we could close on the clubhouse within 2 weeks, just in time for the annual HOA meeting that Margaret was planning to use to consolidate her power permanently. But first, I had to get through another week of Margaret's escalating attacks. She didn't disappoint. Tuesday morning brought a certified letter informing me that the HOA board had voted to revoke my water access privileges pending resolution of my outstanding fines. Wednesday, I found stakes and orange tape marking areas of my property that allegedly violated setback requirements. Thursday, a county health inspector showed up to investigate anonymous complaints about my septic system. Each new assault felt like Margaret tightening a noose around my neck. But now, instead of panic, I felt a strange sense of calm. Every aggressive move she made was just another nail in her own coffin. The more outrageous her behavior became, the stronger my case would be when the tables finally turned. The breaking point came Friday afternoon. I was at my kitchen table, reviewing loan documents, when I heard Margaret's now familiar footsteps on my porch. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 men in cheap suits flanked her as she knocked on my door. "Mr. Morrison," she said, when I opened the door, "these gentlemen are process servers. You're being served with an emergency injunction to cease all unlawful activities on this property, effective immediately." One of the men handed me a thick envelope. "Sir, you're hereby notified that the Pinewood Lake HOA is seeking immediate legal relief to prevent ongoing violations of community standards and potential safety hazards." I scanned the injunction quickly. Margaret was asking a judge to order me to stop using my dock, my outdoor shower, my storage shed, and essentially any part of my property that wasn't the cabin itself. The hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday, 3 days before the HOA annual meeting. "You have a choice, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You can continue this pointless fight and lose everything, or you can accept my generous offer to purchase your property at fair market value. I'm prepared to write you a check today for $150,000, no inspections, no contingencies, 30-day close." It was a low-ball offer for a property worth at least $200,000, but Margaret was betting I was desperate enough to take it. She was also betting I didn't know about the clubhouse situation. "That's a very generous offer," I said carefully. "Can I have until Monday to think about it?" Margaret's smile was triumphant. She thought she'd won. "Of course. But after Monday, the offer expires, and we proceed with the foreclosure. I think you'll find that's a much less pleasant process." As her little parade marched back to their cars, I couldn't help but smile. In 4 days, Margaret Thornfield was going to get the shock of her life. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the clubhouse meeting room. It was supposed to be Margaret's moment of triumph, the formal ratification of her power grab, and the final expulsion of anyone who opposed her vision for the community. I arrived at 9:45, carrying a briefcase that contained the deed to the clubhouse property, along with a folder full of eviction notices that Sarah had prepared. The parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it, apparently. Margaret's reign of terror had motivated people to show up. Inside, Margaret had arranged the meeting room like a corporate boardroom, with herself at the head of a long table and her 2 board allies flanking her. She was wearing another of her ridiculous power suits, and her smile was so smug it could have been bottled and sold as concentrated arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "welcome to what I hope will be a historic day for our community. Today, we're going to vote on several important measures that will ensure Pinewood Lake maintains the highest standards of—" "Point of order," I said, standing up in the back of the room. "Before we proceed with any official business, I have an announcement to make." Margaret's smile faltered. "Mr. Morrison, you're not a board member. You don't have the right to—" "Actually, I do." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the clubhouse deed. "As of yesterday afternoon, I am the legal owner of this building and the property it sits on. And as the property owner, I'm hereby giving the current board 30 days' notice to vacate the premises." The room erupted. Half the people started talking at once, while the other half sat in stunned silence. Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of purple that reminded me of an angry eggplant. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "The HOA owns this building." "The HOA had the right to use this building," I corrected, "as long as you maintained your financial obligations to the mortgage company. Since you defaulted on those obligations, that right has been terminated. I bought the property from the bank for full cash payment." I'd never seen someone literally rendered speechless before, but Margaret managed it. She opened and closed her mouth several times like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Tom Patterson started laughing a deep belly laugh that was probably years in the making. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Jake, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Wait just a minute," said one of Margaret's board allies, a thin man named Peterson, who'd moved to the lake 6 months earlier. "You can't just buy the clubhouse and throw us out. We have legal rights." "You had legal rights," Sarah Chen said, appearing in the doorway with her own briefcase. "Rights that were contingent on fulfilling your financial obligations. Since the HOA is currently insolvent and in default on multiple contractual agreements, those rights are void." She handed Margaret a thick folder. "These are formal eviction notices for the board and any other unauthorized occupants of the premises. You have 30 days to remove your personal property and cease all operations." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Margaret's allies tried to argue that the sale was illegal, that I'd somehow engineered the HOA's financial collapse, that the whole thing was a conspiracy. But their protests sounded increasingly hollow as more residents began to understand what had happened. "So what happens now?" asked Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd been fined for parking her RV. "Now we start over," I said. "The HOA still exists, and you still need community governance. But it's going to be governance by consent, not by threats and intimidation. And if you want to use this building for meetings, you'll be dealing with a landlord who actually lives in the community and cares about its well-being." Margaret finally found her voice. "This isn't over, Morrison. I'll sue you, the bank, everyone involved in this fraudulent transaction." You'll what?" I interrupted. "You'll file more violation notices? Send more process servers? Report me to more county agencies? Margaret, you've spent the last 4 months teaching me exactly how this game is played. The difference is, I'm playing to build something instead of tear it down." The truth was, I had no intention of being anyone's landlord long-term. My plan was to work with Tom and the other longtime residents to transfer ownership of the clubhouse back to a properly managed HOA1 with transparent finances, reasonable rules, and leaders who remembered that they were supposed to serve the community, not rule it. But Margaret didn't need to know that. At least, not yet. As the meeting broke up, I found myself standing on the clubhouse porch, looking out at the lake through the morning mist. The water was still and peaceful, reflecting the pine trees like a mirror. For the first time in months, I could appreciate the view without wondering what fresh hell was waiting in my mailbox. Tom Patterson joined me on the porch, still chuckling. "Jake, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this?" "Since about 10 minutes after Sarah Chen suggested it," I admitted. "To be honest, I didn't know if it would actually work." "Well, it worked. Margaret's loading her car right now, and she looks like someone stole her favorite cat." I watched through the trees as Margaret Thornfield carried boxes out of the clubhouse, her perfect composure finally cracking. Her 2 bored allies had already disappeared, probably racing home to figure out how to distance themselves from the sinking ship. "Think she'll actually sue?" Tom asked. "Probably. But Sarah seems to think we're on solid legal ground, and Margaret's going to have a hard time finding a lawyer willing to take a case where she's clearly the villain." The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret had spent months trying to force me out of my cabin, and now she was the one packing up and leaving. She'd wielded the HOA covenants like a weapon, only to discover that every weapon could be turned against its user. As her car disappeared down the gravel road, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. 3 months later, I was back on my dock with my morning coffee, watching the loons dive for fish while the sun painted the pine trees gold. The lake community had elected a new board, Tom Patterson as president, Mrs. Henderson as secretary, and a local retired teacher named Jim Walsh as treasurer. Their first official act was to rescind all of Margaret's violation notices and establish a reasonable, transparent process for community governance. The clubhouse mortgage had been transferred to a community trust, with monthly payments split among all the residents based on a fair assessment of property values and ability to pay. I'd kept ownership of the building temporarily, but the plan was to transfer it back to the community once the new board had proven it could manage finances responsibly. Margaret's house went up for sale 2 weeks after the confrontation at the clubhouse. According to the local real estate gossip, she'd moved to a gated community 3 hours away somewhere with professional property management and neighbors who were too busy to care about her power games. I never found out whether she followed through on her threats to sue. My guess is that her lawyers took one look at the situation and advised her to cut her losses. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the consequences of their own actions. The lake is peaceful again. My dock still shows its age. my kayak still sits on its weathered rack, and my outdoor shower still violates probably half a dozen building codes. But none of that matters now, because the people making the rules are the same people who have to live by them. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world. Margaret Thornfield taught me a valuable lesson about power. It's not about the authority you can grab, but about the respect you can earn. She spent months trying to rule through fear and intimidation, only to discover that real communities are built on something much stronger than expensive letterhead and legal threats. They're built on trust. And trust, as it turns out, is something you can't foreclose.